There we go. All right, so good morning. My name is Jenny Crittenden and I am room hosting for Jason on his presentation about classroom pilot study on semi-repeated reading. Take it away.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Jason Goodier. I'm an associate professor at Heisei University. I'm a fairly recent graduate of Temple University, and this is my first independent study that I've done since graduating, and it's about this semi-repeated reading activity that I did in a class. So I'm going to be talking about that as we go along. Okay, so in this presentation, I'll give a little introduction of the project, what I'm doing, a very short literature review. I'll get into the methodology of how I did the study, talk about the results, discussion, and finish off with a short conclusion and a bit of advice for other teachers who are conducting any classroom research. Okay, so I'll start off with a little quote here from Neil Gaiman. Sometimes we choose the paths we follow, sometimes our choices are made for us, and sometimes we have no choice at all. I chose this quote for not only because Neil Gaiman's a good writer, who I enjoy his work a lot, but this idea of choosing paths is kind of a theme that kind of goes through not only the topic of my talk, but how I kind of came up with the talk itself. So really this project started quite a long time ago, and it started with my Aunt Jean. In a lot of ways, I've been following in her path for many years of my life because she was an elementary school teacher for 35 years, and I've become a teacher. She enjoys traveling around the world. So do I. She plays golf. So do I. And she never married, never had any kids, and I'm kind of in the same boat in that regard as well. And since she never had any kids growing up, she kind of spoiled me and my brother by buying us lots of books, including this series, who, if you're a child of the 80s, this Choose Your Own Adventure series of books was very popular. And that kind of led me into this project because a couple of years ago, I found in some of the catalogs for the books that are available for teachers and whatnot, I found this Atamai series of books, which is basically a choose your own adventure style book. And I thought that was really cool, and I thought it might be something to try out with my students. And during my studies at Temple University, I got a chance to study under Dr. David Begler, and he spoke very passionately, I guess, about the benefits, the need really for extensive reading in developing students developing their language abilities. I also had the chance to study briefly under Dr. Roy Lister, who he also spoke very passionately about the need for classroom research as opposed to only lab research. So kind of thinking of this series of books and these two teachers who gave me these ideas, it's kind of how I came up with the idea to conduct this pilot study. So getting into a bit of a literature review, it's, I think, fairly well known that a lot of L2 students feel a lot of anxiety about reading, especially longer forms of reading, because they might feel that they don't have the ability, they don't have the language skill, the vocabulary level in order to really understand a book, and it might become very frustrating if they don't understand stuff, which is why reading at an appropriate level is necessary, which leads into the extensive reading used as a technique of language learning. So within extensive learning, it's basically should be large amounts of reading done at an appropriate level in which at least 95% of the vocabulary is already known, which allows students to read somewhat fluently. Another key point of extensive reading is that students have a choice of the materials that they want to read. It's not dictated to them by the teacher. Some of the stats that I've seen about extensive reading or reading in general is that between 200 and 250 words per minute is kind of ideal. But one study by Nations showed that in L2 students, most of them are reading at about 100 to 150 words per minute, which is quite a bit slower than ideal, which means they need to do a lot more reading in order to slowly build up that skill. All right, another study that I read was Taguchi and Gorsuch, which talked about repeated reading, which is reading the same material over and over again. And of course, this leads to increased reading speeds. It allows students to develop chunking because they're able to recognize by reading over and over again, they're able to put more and more words together. And but their study also showed that L2 learners, the benefits of this are a little bit lower. And kind of as a side note, Ellis has said that in terms of repeated exposure to vocabulary, words should be encountered up to 11 times before they might actually be acquired. All right, now timed reading is just measuring the time that it takes to read something and then the speed at which students are reading. So it's never really studied on its own. It's kind of always an aspect of these different kinds of reading studies in which students are doing different forms of reading in the classroom or for research. So my title of my paper is Semi-Repeated Reading. What exactly is that? Well, it's not extensive reading, it's not repeated reading, it's not just timed reading. Semi-repeated reading is really what happens with these kinds of choose your own adventure type books, in which you're always starting the book at the same point, but as you make choices during the reading, you're always getting into new paths and new material. So there's always going to be a certain number of pages in a reading session that are repeated, but there's always going to be a certain number of pages and material that is new. So it's not completely repeated reading, it's semi-repeated reading. So I think the potential benefits of this is you're getting the benefit of exposure to that vocabulary multiple times. And because these books are quite fun, I really enjoyed reading them as a child. I'm hoping that students, if they read them, they'll kind of break down some of those affective barriers that they might have about reading, and it might serve as a gateway into reading other materials. Now, I did do a little check on places like Google Scholar and stuff like that to see if any research has been done using these kinds of choose your own adventure type books. And I didn't really find any research that's used these before. So that's why I kind of had to coin the term semi-repeated reading. So hopefully it's kind of a very limited market, I guess you could say, in the graded readers and stuff like that. But I think it's kind of unique. So anyway, let's get on. So with my study, I'm basically trying to answer 4 questions. Does semi-repeated reading have observable effects on reading fluency, so the speed of reading? Is the vocabulary that students are checking during semi-repeated reading sessions retained when encountered in other readings? Third, does semi-repeated reading of graded readers have any effect on reading motivation? And then finally, are these books appropriate? Are they at an appropriate level for my students? Okay. Here's where I conducted this study. It was at a Japanese university here in Tokyo. The class itself is a 4 skills elective class in which we do reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And all of the different activities that I'm doing in this class are kind of based on CAF, complexity, accuracy, and fluency. So this elective class in 2019 was for 3rd-year students majoring in global communication. And it was held on Monday, every Monday for 2 semesters, the spring semester and the fall semester, in Monday in the first period, which is kind of exactly the time that it is right now. And being third-year students on Monday in a first period, I only had 3 students sign up for the class. So it made for a nice, very cozy lesson because we could really get down and work together a lot. But it is a very limited sample, but kind of ideal, I think, for a pilot study like this. So you can see the 3 students who are in here. They're kind of at different levels. There's 1 girl, 2 boys. The girl, student A, was probably the highest in the class. Student B, he's the only one who had a lot of overseas experience. He did a 6-month study abroad the year prior to doing this class. And student C was definitely the lowest in the class, but very, very hardworking, very inspired to improve his English. So you can see that there are a lot of individual differences here. So there's no, I'm not going to come up with any kind of standardized universal findings at the end of this. The individual differences are pretty large overall. And I think that's kind of a good thing for a classroom study. I'll talk a little bit more about that after. Now, I should also note that I had taught all 3 of these students in classes beforehand. Student B, I probably taught in 3 or 4 other classes during his first 2 years at the university. And student A, I believe I taught twice before. And student C is the one I knew the least. And I taught him once before. All right, so the actual books. I used 2 books from the Atama'i series, and I analyzed the vocabulary using lextutor.ca. And the books themselves, they say that there's 800 to 880 words per ending, but my analysis showed that that's actually a little bit longer. There's up around over 900 words per path. But the head words are, as it says on the book, around 300. That's pretty accurate. You can see that in terms of the vocabulary, it's not a very complex book. There's not a lot of words, and the vocabulary choice is basically at a grade 3 level. That was for the first book, Zombies in Tokyo. The second book, Tornado Alley, which we did in the 2nd semester, comes in similarly with the words and the head words. The vocabulary breakdown comes in as slightly easier at a grade 2 level. All right, the actual reading sessions, because it was a 4 skills class, the reading branch of the class came up every 4 weeks. So every 4 weeks, we would do a reading session in each semester. So 3 reading sessions per book, and we did 1 book in each semester. Students were free to choose the path they want. All they had to do while reading was using their stopwatch on their smartphone is time how long it takes to read each page, including the vocabulary checking time. If they want to check any vocabulary they don't know, they just basically, they start the stopwatch when they start reading the page, they read, they check the vocabulary. When they're ready to turn to the next page, they stop the stopwatch and they keep track of that. And they make a list of the words that they haven't, did not know. So this basically means that these first initial pages in a book are the ones that are repeated definitely in every session. The pages here are possibly repeated depending on the choices that they make as they read. And the last group of pages, the final page of each path, is only read once. Now, my goal with this, because it is a classroom research, I didn't want this to seem like I'm stopping everything to do research. I wanted this to fit seamlessly into a lesson and seem like it is a lesson-based activity. So my way of doing that was to make it as non-intrusive as possible, where they simply get a handout where they can note the pages that they've read in the path, the time it took them to read, and then any of the words and notes that they want to take while reading that particular page. And they hand this back into me. At the end of each reading session, we did some post-reading questionnaires, and at the end of the semester, there was a post-test, which I'll talk about now. So in the post-test, I wanted to assess whether the words that they were checking during these reading sessions, whether they would be able to understand them and explain them in another context. So I took those words and created some new passages, new reading passages in which the vocabulary was highlighted and they would have to explain the words that were highlighted. So the 2 post-tests that I wrote, one for each semester, actually came in as being a little bit more difficult overall in terms of the difficulty of the reading. All right, let's get into some results and see what the students actually did. So in each of these pages, you'll have the, so this is for Zombies in Tokyo, student A. These are the 3 reading sessions coming down, and these are the pages that were read on that particular path. There's always 8 pages. So the time indicates how long it took them to read the page, including the vocabulary checking. If there's a number in parentheses next to the time, that indicates how many vocabulary words were checked on that page. So in this case, they checked one word, no words, 1 word, 2 words, no word, and then 1 here. Now, this is student A. She showed pretty consistent decreases in reading time. I just found one little kind of thing that sticks out a little bit. This student only took 48 seconds to read the page, but checked 1 vocabulary word, which doesn't seem to fit in with the other vocabulary checkings of that session. Student A on the second book in the second semester, again, the times are basically decreasing with each reading session as you come along. There's a couple of strange aberrations where, in this case, the student took much longer on the 3rd session, back to almost the same time as the 1st session. And again, kind of checking the word, checking vocabulary, but still the time is almost at the same as the other ones. It could be, it's just a bit strange. Okay, student B basically showed repeated decreases with time. There's a couple of small aberrations, like here between the 2nd and 3rd session, the time actually increased back slightly. Not a huge amount, but a little bit. And on student B's second book in the 2nd semester, nothing really stands out as being strange or anything. It was pretty consistent overall, and the student was getting pretty much faster in every session. Now, student C, as you can see, is, like I said, was probably the lowest level student who was checking a lot of vocabulary compared to the other students. And this is not something all that special, but basically on the 2nd time that this student was reading pages, I was just surprised by how consistent the time is. These are all within 2 or 3 seconds of each other. So basically every 2nd time the student is reading a page, his speed is like spot on. It's just kind of interesting. All right, and on student C's second book, pretty much again, pretty consistent across the board with increases in reading time, and just one aberration where the final page of the 1st session is actually the 2nd fastest page that this student has ever read in across the board on the entire project. So it kind of stands out as being, wow, maybe something strange is going on there. Okay, so that's basically the data that I collected. It was just the amount of time and which words they were checking. But because, like I said, I wanted to be non-intrusive, I wanted to collect, to make this as classroom-like as possible. So it just seems like they're submitting a short report. But from that information, I wanted to see if I could do a deeper analysis and get more information about what's happening in these reading sessions. So in order to do that, the time that they record with their stopwatch is the reading and vocabulary checking time together. But I wanted to see if I could get more of a pure reading time out of that, to kind of think, what if they're only reading and they're not checking any vocabulary, if they just understand everything? So in order to do that, I have to make one pretty big assumption, but it's a logical one, I think. So basically it's that the pages in the reading session that the student is not checking any vocabulary, I can use those as a baseline to create an average from which I can extrapolate the actual reading speed. So I'll explain it. So if we take a look here. So this is the raw data that I got. I know the number of words in each session that they read, and this is the amount of time the entire reading session took. And if you just do a simple calculation on that, you can get a words per minute rate. But like I said, these speeds of reading are probably, well, they're not accurate because they include vocabulary checking time, where they stopped reading, checked their dictionary, and came back to the book. So I wanted to try and get away from that. So we're going to use actually student B's session 1 of Zombies in Tokyo here to do that. So here's the raw data that I'm able to calculate. From this data, I'm able to calculate this, which allows me to get to a better or more accurate, I feel, rate of speed. Let me show you an example using this calculation, just so that you know that I'm not inventing this. So we start with the total time of pages with no checked vocabulary. So I call this the uninterrupted reading. In this case, the student was 6.5 minutes, and that was over 5 pages. So this student had 5 pages where they didn't stop to check vocabulary. They just read. So if I make an average of that, that gets me at about 1 minute and 20 seconds average time to read 1 page. Now we know that one reading session is 8 pages, so if I multiply that by 8, I get the full reading time, which is about 10.5 minutes. This full reading time, if you compare with the total reading session time, it's about 2 minutes less, so it's a pretty big amount, it's a big number. So this is my assumed, this is the key time that I get, that I use to do a lot of calculations. So it is based on this assumption, but like I said, to me, it feels like kind of a logical assumption. And from this time now, I can use the number of words in the session to get the more, I feel, accurate actual reading speed, which you can see here. If you use the original information, it's 75 words per minute, but the actual speed that I calculate is about 88.5. So it's a pretty big increase as well. So I did this calculation for all 3 students for both books for every session, and these are the more accurate reading speeds that I got based on that, which you can see is basically increasing across the board, except in one case, which I'll talk about in a minute. But when I get these numbers right away, what I can see is the difference in the levels of the students. So if you take student A's very first session, the first book, first session, 136 words per minute. This is almost the same as student B's third session of the first book, which is almost the same as student C's first session of the second book in the second semester. So just from finding a number like this, which is pretty close, you can really see the difference in the levels of the students visually. And now take a look at the student. So student A, big increase from session 1 to 2, and then a very small increase into session 3. So that led me to believe that possibly this reading rate of about 170, 175 words per minute might be pretty close to this student's current peak speed. And then we noticed that in the second book, they actually never achieved that speed and actually dropped a little bit. So I don't really have an explanation for that, other than maybe she was having a bad day that day. Who knows? All right, now if you compare that with the student B and student C, you can still see that even on the third session, there are pretty big increases happening, which means they probably have not reached their peak reading speed yet. And but student C is starting to level out a little bit by the end. And as I said, he's the lowest student in the class, maybe about 150 words per minute, could be around his peak reading speed. Now, I wanted to do a bit of a deeper analysis on vocabulary as well. So starting with that statistic that I just calculated, this one here, the blue one, the full reading time. So if I deduct that from the total time, that leaves me with basically the amount of time that the students probably spent checking the vocabulary. So this is from student C's Zombies session 1. This was the session where he checked the most vocabulary. So if you take this checking time and divide it by the unknown vocabulary, you end up with an average amount of time that it takes to check one word, one vocabulary word. So again, this calculation, I did it over every single session. And here's the one that I just calculated, 35 seconds per word. You can see that student C is spending quite a bit of time checking his vocabulary. And if you compare that with, say, student A, who's based on this calculation, the most time that she is spending checking vocabulary is about 20 seconds per word. So I should also note that based on the papers they gave me with the notes about the vocabulary, student C is the only student who was actually writing the vocabulary and a Japanese definition of the word. Students A and B were just writing the English vocabulary with no extra notes at all. Student B's amount of time for checking vocabulary falls somewhere in the middle. All right, in terms of the actual vocabulary that the students checked, I analyzed that as well using lextutor.ca, and you can see that the vast majority of the words from the Zombies in Tokyo book fall in the top 2,000 words in English, and a few off-list words and some automatopoeia show up in here. If you compare that with the Tornado Alley book, the vast majority of the checked vocabulary is from the off list, including many words, funnel and debris, which were checked not only in one session, but checked in 2 sessions. So by looking at the words, because I wanted to figure out if this is kind of an appropriate extensive reading book in which at least 95% of the vocabulary is known, I analyzed the vocabulary and their unknown vocabulary in 2 ways. First with the total amount of words, and also then with the head words in each reading session. And you can see from the percentages of unknown words that for student A, this definitely falls in the no problem zone. This is definitely within that 95% known vocabulary. The highest stat she got was 2%, and that's based on the head words. Student B was actually even better. The highest that he ever got was just over 1%. Whereas the only student who fell outside that 95% known vocabulary, student C, and it was only in the Zombies in Tokyo book during the first session, in which if you count based on head words, not total words, his total was about 6.5% unknown. But by the second session, the student is falling well within that necessary range for extensive reading. All right, the post-tests. So this is the first post-test for the Zombies in Tokyo book. I looked at that list of words that the students checked, and I selected 10 words and put them into a new reading text for them to read. So in each column for student A, B, and C, the first one is checked. That means, yes, this was one of the words that was checked by that student. So as you know, student C checked the most vocabulary, so pretty much all of the words fall into his column. A circle in the test means that yes, they were able to write a definition of the word, explain the meaning. A slash means they kind of got it. They were kind of halfway there, but it's not a perfect explanation. And X means they did not. They wrote something, but it was incorrect. And as you can see, there are several cases where the students wrote don't know or forgot. And when I saw this after the fact, it led to kind of a revelation that relates to my teaching, which I'll talk about later. I'll come back to that in the discussion section. The second, I'll just give you the scores as well. So basically, the highest level student actually got the lowest score on this first post-test. Even the lowest level student got slightly higher. Okay, now the second post-test in the second semester, I should go back and just say, I got really lucky with the Zombies in Tokyo book. I never told the students which path to follow in the book of the 8 paths. They just kind of coincidentally almost all followed the same paths over the course of the 3 sessions. So it was very easy for me to choose the vocabulary because it was guaranteed that all students had encountered that same vocabulary in at least one of their reading sessions. That did not happen with the Tornadoes book. They all chose different paths, which meant that in order to guarantee that I'm using vocabulary on the post test that everyone has encountered, I had to choose limited to those first few pages of the book that definitely everyone had read. So that means that in order to fill up at least 10 words here for the post-test, I had to select some other vocabulary from those initial pages, and I was going to use this to see if these are words they did not check. I wanted to see if they were able to write a definition for them, and sometimes they weren't. So even vocabulary that they did not have a problem with in the initial reading, when they got to the post-test, they were not able to give definitions for those words. And again, you'll see here that I got a whole bunch of I don't knows, and like I said, I'll come back to that later. In terms of the scores, wow, the lowest level student actually got the highest score in this case of 7 out of 10. So quite a mixed thing in there. Now, in terms of reading motivation, after the reading sessions, we always did a little discussion and stuff. And this is one of the big problems, the big failings that I had, is that I didn't collect any data in the first semester about the kind of reading motivation stuff. I only thought to collect it in the second semester. So all of this upcoming information about reading motivation really comes only from the second semester. But the questions themselves are centered on these books and reading in general. All right, so after the second semester, after the first session, they answered 3 questions. Did you enjoy reading the story? Was it easy or difficult? Were you surprised by the story? They all enjoyed the story. In the second question, they indicated the vocabulary overall was easy, but one student said that the content was a little difficult. I think the tornado-based content, because it's something that they were unfamiliar with. And 2 students indicated that the details about the tornadoes and tornado hunters was quite surprising. So it's not so much the endings of the stories that were surprising to them, it was more about the actual content was surprising. The second questionnaire conducted after the second session, I basically was giving them choices. They had to choose the answer that best matched them. And here's where I made an attempt to kind of go back in time and fix my mistake of not collecting data in the first semester. So I wanted them to think back to before joining this class, how they felt about reading. So there's probably a validity issue here for sure, that so take these answers with a bit of a grain of salt, because they were collected long after the fact, so they may not accurately reflect their feelings. But the choices they had were: I don't want to read English books, English is too difficult, I'm interested but I'm worried, I want to try, and I'm very interested. And the answers they gave here was 2 said they were worried, and 1 said that they want to try. Now, the second question was basically, how do you feel now with the same 5 choices? And in this question, 2 of them said they want to read English books, and 1 has said they're very interested and want to read a lot. And yes, it was the same 2 students who were at 3 before who moved to 4, and the one who went 4 went to 5. So yeah. There was one last question, this style of book, because I wanted to ask about this kind of choose your own adventure style book. I wanted to find out how it affected their motivation. Either increased a lot, increased a little, decreased a lot, or had no effect. And I got 1 at the increased a lot and 2 at the increased a little. After the third and final reading session of the second semester, I gave them a much more detailed questionnaire. These questions were provided in English and Japanese, and they were allowed to answer in English or Japanese. And 2 students answered in Japanese, and I had my colleague translate some of the answers. So the first question was, would you like to do more English reading in the classroom, and why? 2 students said yes, but 1 student is worried about the level of the readings, and actually not so much worried that the level will be too difficult. He specifically said he's worried that it'll be too easy and boring. Would you like to do more English reading outside the classroom? Everyone said yes, and 1 student said it's for overall language improvement. 1 of them said they want to be able to do more email communication, reading and writing, and 1 student said for pleasure. What would you like to read in the English? And if you can describe the genre and the level. One student said they want to read long fiction. One student said they want to read movie novelizations, and another student said they want to read newspapers. And compared to other skills, listening, speaking, writing, how important do you think reading is? Everyone said they felt it's pretty much of equal importance, but one answer really stood out because this student made the connection between reading and speaking, saying that it's better to learn a word through reading first, and that way when you hear it listening or when you're trying to communicate it yourself, you will know the word. So he basically was saying that reading should come first before other skills. And what do you think is most important when it comes to reading English, and why? One student said knowing the individual words, and one student, same student who made this comment in question 4, said knowing the sounds of the words. So this student is really understanding that spelling and pronunciation are quite different and don't match up quite often. And another student noted that the repetition, repeating reading is beneficial. All right, coming back to the research questions for the discussion now. Does the semi-repeated reading have observable effects? Yeah, I mean, with the stats, even without doing my calculation of trying to get that better reading speed, the speeds are going up with every session. So, and sometimes by quite a bit, especially between the second and third sessions for everybody. So yeah, I think that was pretty clear that yes, we can see the effects. Is vocabulary that was checked during the reading sessions retained in other readings? Not entirely. That was a much more less conclusive. They could describe and explain some of the words, and some of the other ones they couldn't. Possibly they are not encountering the vocabulary enough to completely retain it. The different context may have an effect. And there's some other validity issues, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. All right, does the semi-repeated reading of graded readers have an effect on reading motivation? It appears so. I'm not going to say conclusively yes, but they all indicated that their desire to read is increasing somewhat. And they're understanding that reading is not isolated, that it has a part in overall language ability. And like I said, one student is recognizing the need for repetition. And then finally, are these books at an appropriate level for my students? With the exception of that first session of student C, basically they're all falling within that 95% of known vocabulary, which means they can read pretty fluently. So overall, yes, I would say it's at an appropriate level. It might even be a little bit too easy. Some of the students might need something a little bit more challenging because, yeah, they're really just blasting through it very quickly. Okay, now problems. In terms of reading speed and fluency, this assumption that I make in order to make my calculations, I don't know if it would hold up to scrutiny scientifically, but as for my needs in the classroom, making that assumption and those calculations worked. And I don't really see a way that something more scientifically accurate or acceptable could be done without it being more intrusive on the reading experience. So like I said, this is really a classroom activity that I'm doing, and I want it to seem like a classroom activity. So I don't really know if there's any way that I could get that information without it being more like a lab type situation. All right, vocabulary retention. Here's where this I don't know, a lot of students are writing down, I don't know, and this might be completely my fault because like I said, I've taught all these students before, and one of my pet peeves as a teacher is when students leave a blank on any kind of test or assessment or anything like that. And I've kind of drilled into them to try every question, but if you really don't know, write down, I don't know. So when students write down, I don't know on this kind of assessment, does it really mean they don't know? Or does it mean they can't explain it in English, but they could in Japanese? Does it mean they don't remember? So basically, my post-test has a big flaw in that I didn't allow for more ways to explain the vocabulary. Because like I said, student C was actually writing down definitions between English and Japanese on his submitted paper. So on the post-test, if I had said you can write your answer in English or Japanese, who knows, maybe these they would have been able to answer a lot more of the vocabulary than what they were actually able to do. And there's, of course, some more validity issues. One of the validity issues is during the actual reading sessions, I never got them to define the words, but now in a post-test, I'm asking them to define the words, which means it's something new they've never had to do before. And then, of course, there's no pre-test. The post-test, I'm not really sure. It doesn't really, there's a validity issue there. So I'll leave it at that. All right, now in terms of the reading motivation, like I said, I didn't collect any data in the first semester, and I also didn't collect any data at the start, even before doing a reading session. So that was a big mistake on my part. Some of it was discussed, but I never collected it. So basically the moral of this story is prepare, make sure that you're preparing ahead of time. You're thinking about that kind of stuff before. Okay. And student numbers, I mean, there's only 3 participants. This is a very small sample size. I am currently doing a larger study. I've moved it from 3rd-year students to 2nd-year students. And there's, in the first semester, I have about 25 students on who I gathered data. And in the second semester, about 15. And those 15 are also part of the original 25. So I'm going to get quite a bit of data on this much larger study. And again, another issue with students is in this kind of study, do I need a control group, and how would I go about doing that? These are questions that I kind of keep thinking about and keep putting off finding a proper answer. If anyone has any good ideas or suggestions about that, please feel free to let me know. All right, the future. So this is, like I said, I am doing the larger study right now, and I think the quantitative stuff, gathering the data and making those calculations, seem to work out fine. So I'm really focused in the larger study on making sure I'm getting all that qualitative data, getting information before they actually start reading, during every single reading session, gathering different kinds of qualitative data. And hopefully I'll be able to get a better idea about their motivation towards reading over the course of a full year by gathering all this data. And another big change that I've done in my current study that's going on right now is after every reading session, I'm giving the students their reading statistics and explaining to them what it is and what it means, hopefully to see if that has any effect on their reading motivation, whether seeing their actual numbers going up session by session, to see if that has any kind of effect. All right, in conclusion, I'm going to finish with some advice because, as you know, it's the online communities of teachers and learners. I want to be a contributing member to this community of teachers. So if any of you out here are wanting to do more classroom study, this is just a bit of general tips and advice that I kind of came up with. Basically, first, invest your time in researching something that you enjoy. So as you saw at the beginning of this presentation, I kind of have a strong connection to this kind of book based on my own childhood experience. And that helped my motivation in order to do this. If I was dealing with reading of texts and books that I didn't enjoy, I probably wouldn't be willing to put in the effort to do all these calculations and stuff like that. Next, this is really important, I think. Talk to your students about why you want to conduct research using their performance. I told all my students at the beginning of this project that I've learned a lot from other teachers and other research, and it's a good way to give back to other teachers. So their performance, the students' performance on these kinds of activities will inform the teachers, which will generate the research, which will help other teachers to help other students. So it kind of comes full circle from student to student. And if you explain it that way, you'll probably get no problem with the students accepting to participate. So over the course of these now 2 years that I've been doing this, the first pilot study, which was 3 students, and the current study with up to 25, every single student said yes to participate in these studies. Now, classroom research. I'm gathering a small amount of data, but I'm turning it into something bigger. But I mean, you know, you can do anything from a simple questionnaire to a large study. Anything that you're gathering from students could be just based on homework, a questionnaire, a simple speaking performance, or whatever. You can generate data from that. You can generate research papers, which, you know, that's basically what we're trying to do. We're all trying to get these things into our resume. So don't be afraid to try something simple. It can work. All right, next, gather some data that can be used to help your students. So this is something that, like I said, that I changed in my current study, is I'm actually giving the students their statistics so that they can see their own improvement rather than just keeping this information for myself. So, you know, yeah, just try think of something that benefits not only your research and your resume, but also something that helps your students themselves in the moment. All right, now classroom research, it's messy. As you can see from my statistics, there's aberrations all over the place. You know, don't feel bad about that. Embrace that. Just say, look, this is classroom research. This is an elective class with a mixed level students. That's the way it is, you know. And comes time to do a presentation or a paper, just say it, you know, my students are all over the place, and that's fine, I think. And finally, for me, using CAF, complexity, accuracy, and fluency activities, for me, having these mixed level classes, this is quite effective because the activities that I'm choosing to do can be done by students of various levels. They just perform these activities at the level that they are at. As we can see from the reading, some students are taking 25 minutes for a reading session. Other students are taking like 6 minutes, and that is fine. They're operating at their own level. So if you can think of activities that work in that way, I think that's a really good way to deal with mixed level classes. Okay, so to wrap it up, if you're going to do classroom research, it requires lots of students who will attend the classes. They will participate. You got to do lots of preparation, have some ideas about where you're going. And that's why I really, really recommend doing a smaller pilot study like this, because this is where you make all your mistakes. And then your bigger study that you do the next year is going to work out much, 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 much better. So anyway, that pretty much finishes everything for me. Thank you very much for listening. And if anyone has any questions now, please feel free to ask here, or you can contact me at j.goodier@thu.ac.jp, and I'll be happy to give you any answers or questions you have. Big special thanks to Wendy Davis and Ryan McGuire, who really helped me out in the early parts of getting this presentation ready. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Let's open it up.
Round of applause, please. Yeah, everybody, thank you very much. And please ask your questions. Go ahead.
I'd love to ask some questions.
Please, go ahead.
Sure, very interesting and very helpful for me. I'm wondering, this probably only took about 15 minutes at most. So the rest of the class, you were doing something else, were you?
Yeah. The very first session of the first semester, it basically took up the entire lesson while I explained how to do it and stuff like that. And that first session, the students obviously take a lot longer, but by the second session, I was seeing that the times were coming down. And when it came around to the third session of the second semester, I knew that I only needed to allocate about like 30 minutes of class time to do this activity. So I had them doing other reading activities in those lessons.
Right. And you did it 3 times and it was once a month, basically. The 3 times each time was separated by a month. Yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah. So I have a lot of freedom in my in my university to develop my curriculum. So I made it a 4 skills class, and we started off with listening, speaking,
just so you know,
reading,
Mark is
writing.
in the SIG room with no breakout rooms open or nothing. So if you walk in, you just have this big blank screen that says Mark Brierley, and that's it. There's no rooms or anything.
Somebody else is talking. So anyway.
I am so sorry. I am so sorry. There was a
No
problem.
problem. That's okay.
Myself. So sorry.
Yeah. No worries. So yeah, so basically it's once a month,
Okay,
basically,
thank you.
per semester.
Okay. I've got more questions, but probably other people do too, so I'll just shut up.
Sure, go ahead.
If I can, I really appreciated the conclusion where you mentioned about your advice on doing research and admitting that, you know, classroom-based research is going to be messy, but
Yeah.
it's still very valuable. And
Sure.
I think that's really appreciated. I wish everyone would end with something on that note.
That's, like I said at the start of my presentation, I got a chance to study under Roy Lister, and that's the point he made, is just that, you know, lab research is going to be, at the end of it, you're going to have those specific people is generalized only to those specific people, whereas classroom research, it might not be generalizable, but it's kind of, it's reflects reality a lot more. So, and I really took that to heart. That really, you know, that's kind of where I'm at in my research and teaching, is the lab stuff. I don't really know how to apply it to the classroom. So. And if anyone doesn't know, this is Marcos Benavides. He's the actual editor of the book series that I used here. So yeah.
I had actually a question about how you selected. You may have mentioned this. I'm sorry, by the way, I was late.
No problem. Yeah.
But how did the students select these 2 particular books? Did you select them?
I selected them. I selected these books, which is kind of just based on my own interest. I chose Zombies in Tokyo first because it's Tokyo. I thought it might be a nice one, and you know, you have things like The Walking Dead are very popular and stuff like that. So so I thought it might be interesting to students. And for the Tornado Alley book, I've just always been interested in tornadoes myself. I like the movie Twister, so that's how I chose it. But in the current study that I'm doing this year, I'm still doing the Zombies in Tokyo book, but I decided to switch up the second book to the Journey to Mars book. So yeah, because that's cool too.
I was also interested in your comment when you said they all followed the same initial path with the Zombies book, but not Tornado. And it's gotten me thinking whether it's got to do with the genre, right? Because it
could be. So basically the 3 students in 3 sessions, that's like 9 different potential reading paths. There were only 4 that were selected during those. So it's just a coincidence, I think, but
I don't know if you think about the genre, right? I mean, if you're reading a book that you know is a zombie book and you know the genre a little bit, which everyone pretty much does, that first choice, you see somebody dead on the ground and they're moving, do you touch them or do you go away? Is a pretty obvious choice for anybody who knows the genre. Whereas with Tornado, it's much more wide open.
It could be, yeah. The only instruction I gave them is to just make sure in each session that they end up on a different page. You know, that's really the only thing I told them. So,
yeah, thank you.
Can I ask another question? And
please go ahead.
Anybody else? Did they know that there was a test?
No, they didn't. Yeah, I kind of sprung that on them.
Okay.
So, you know, the post-test, I mean,
I'm not saying they should have known. I was just curious if they did. And
actually, the post-test itself, I didn't count it as part of. They knew it wasn't going to count. I told them it didn't count towards their actual score, because the activities we were doing is not based on, you know, remembering vocabulary. You know, everything that we were doing in the class was about figuring out where you are at the start and trying to build up to something else. And the post-test was more just like in the last class of the semester, it was more like just like a final review is really what it was, a chance for them to think back on everything that they've done over the course of the semester. So it didn't actually affect their score in any way. It was, I
was just thinking in terms of vocabulary retention, you know, maybe we need that sometimes. We need to actually have kids study those words to retain them. And also the kid who did quite well, the lower level one, he had written the Japanese definition on the sheet. And that maybe that is kind of keen too, just sort of having students write these words in English. Maybe we should ask them, say to them, write the Japanese definition as well?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
lodge it in your
I
brain?
left it open to them because I didn't want, like I said, I'm just trying not to be with the reading session, try to be as non-intrusive as possible. I just gave them the sheet and I said, at least make a list of the English words. Everything else was up to them. So the current study I'm doing right now, like where I'm getting a lot more different people, it's a wide mix. Some people are just writing the English words. Some people are writing full definitions. I even have one student who's actually from Peru, and she's writing English, Spanish, and Japanese on the paper. So anything that helps the students to, you know, remember the vocabulary, I think is fine. You know, they're going to find their own way to do it. So, yeah.
I'll throw out another question there if no one
I
else.
think there was
Oh,
someone had their hand up. I saw a minute ago. Yeah. Was it Nick?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
if
We'll
that's
come
okay.
back to you in a minute, Gene.
No, no worries.
First, thank you for the presentation. It's very
You're welcome.
interesting.
Thanks.
I just had a question regarding extensive reading in general. Of course, based off your literature review, you mentioned how extensive reading is generally just, for fun, and you don't necessarily have any kind of homework or assessment. However, you did also mention in the literature review, you cited Dr. Begler. And I remembered one of his research. He said he kind of advocated, maybe, I don't know if he still advocates now, but he said a nice change for extensive reading would be to include some kind of assessment or homework activity. Do you think, for example, there would be any merit to doing that rather than just reading for fun and checking the words and then moving on? Or what do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, if extensive reading is an actual part of the school program, I don't see why students shouldn't be keeping some kind of diary or some kind of running word list or something like that. There's tons of different ways you could include some kind of extra activity with extensive reading. And a lot of books, including these books here, they do have some activities at the back, which, could be assigned as homework or something like that. So yeah, I don't see any issue with that at all. Obviously, I think it's kind of up to the individual teachers, what they feel comfortable giving, and trying to keep it as extensive reading based as possible, would be good. But yeah, sure, why not?
Cool. All right, thank you.
Yeah, Gene, go ahead, you got a minute?
Anyone else does Paul want to say anything? Or
I just wanted to mention, you could have a hangout room afterwards where people could go for a few minutes after. Would that be okay?
Gene, where are you based?
Right. I was going to tell you right now, I can put the link in, but it's directing to the SIG room, not to Hangouts. That was the issue that it just came up. So, but I think that Mark Brierley is over there, so he can open up a breakout room for you when you get there, if you just tell him you want a breakout room. Okay.
Which room?
It's going to the SIGs room instead of Hangouts. It's a thing in the system, but if you go there, Mark, there's no open rooms, right? The rooms aren't set right now, but Mark can open a room when you get over there. He's hanging out over there, so I'll put the link in here anyway to the event.
All right, thanks. So I'll head over there. If anyone has any more questions, please come join.
See you
Thanks,
there.
everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
So you're going to the SIG room?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, well, everybody, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.
Great.
And